On the day I was due to give birth, Dan's clinically depressed ex-fiancé, Daphne, stormed into the maternity ward, a paring knife, straight into my flank. By the time Dan arrived with the trauma team, I was sprawled in a pool of my own blood beside the delivery bed, the monitors screaming. But he didn't run to me. Instead, he knelt before Daphne, who had been pushed to the floor by a nurse, her elbow slightly scraped. "Dr. Cooper, your wife is in critical condition. We need to get her to the OR immediately." Dan looked up, casting a cold, professional glance over my body. Her wound didn't hit any major organs. She can hold on. Daphne has a severe coagulation disorder. Even a minor scrape can cause her to bleed out. Her situation is more urgent. Give Daphne the 2 units of typed blood we had reserved for the delivery. As they began to wheel her away, I gathered every ounce of my remaining strength to grab the hem of his white lab coat. He frowned, looking down at me. "Daphne didn't do this on purpose, Hannah. She's having an episode. You went to medical school. You of all people should understand." With those words, he pulled a printed non-prosecution waiver from his pocket. He took my hand, slick with my own blood, and pressed my thumb firmly onto the signature line. "The next batch of blood will be here soon. Just hold on a little longer." He carried Daphne out. The hallway was vast, sterile, and quiet. Nobody looked back. Inside my belly, my baby kicked. Once, twice. A desperate, pleading flutter. "Hurry! Get 2 large bore IVs started. Run the fluids under pressure. Someone call the blood bank again. Dr. Gibson, her blood pressure is down to 50. Estimated blood loss is over 2,000 milliliters. Where the hell are those 2 units of packed red cells we reserved?" I was floating above the operating table, watching the frantic huddle around my own body. Dr. Gibson's surgical gown was already soaked through with my blood. I wanted to reach down and touch my belly, but my hand passed through the empty air like mist. Daphne's strike hadn't been the shallow graze Dan assumed. She had slipped past the nurse's station, the knife concealed in her sleeve. When she drove it into me, she had leaned close, whispering in my ear, "Once you and this baby are gone, Dan will have no one left but me." And when she pulled the blade out, she twisted the handle. On purpose. The blood bank just called back. "Dr. Cooper personally signed out those 2 units of reserved blood 5 minutes ago." The circulating nurse's voice cracked on the verge of tears. "Signed them out? Is he out of his mind? That was a high-risk delivery reserve." Dr. Gibson's knuckles turned white. "Dr. Cooper said Miss Bishop has a severe bleeding disorder and needed emergency blood on standby for an arm laceration." The operating room went dead silent. Only the shrill, persistent beep of the monitor cut through the quiet. I watched Dr. Gibson desperately packing laparotomy sponges into my abdomen, trying to stem the torrent. I wanted to tell him to stop, to save his energy. I was never going to get the next batch of blood Dan promised. The rapid, frantic rhythm of the fetal monitor began to drag, slowing down beat by agonizing beat until it flattened into a single, continuous tone. The child who had been kicking me just moments ago went completely still. "Fetal heart rate is gone. She's in V-fib. Prep the defibrillator. 200 joules. Charging. Clear." A dull thud. My body arched off the table, then fell back heavily. The EKG monitor gave a few erratic spikes, then flattened into a cold, horizontal line. "Dr. Cooper says the next shipment of blood from the regional center will be here in 10 minutes, the charge nurse said, pushing through the double doors, her eyes red. Dr. Gibson set the defibrillator paddles down. His voice was completely shot, hollowed out by grief. "Don't bother. Record the time of death. 8:07 p.m. I watched the nurse pull the white sheet over my face, covering my eyes, which were still wide, staring into nothing, just a thin wall away, in a private luxury suite. Dan was gently dabbing an iodine swab onto the tiny scrape on Daphne's elbow. "Dan? Did I kill her?" Daphne huddled in the bed, her shoulders shaking. Dan tossed the swab into the biohazard bin, his voice steady, anchoring. "No, it was just a superficial scratch. You had an episode, Daphne. You weren't in control of yourself. The law won't hold you responsible." But there was so much blood. The way she looked at me, it was terrifying. Her water broke. It was mixed with blood, which made it look worse than it was. She's a doctor. She knew how to protect herself from any real harm. Dan leaned down, gently blowing on her scrape, which had already stopped oozing. "But look at you. You know your coagulation levels aren't perfect. Why were you wandering around? What if this scratch hadn't stopped bleeding?" Daphne leaned into his chest, her tears dampening his white coat. Just below his collar, near the hem, was the bloody print of my hand. The final mark I left before I died. I was just so scared. I thought once the baby came, you wouldn't want me anymore. I couldn't stop myself. "Don't talk like that." He stroked her hair. "I already got her to sign the waiver. Once she delivers and her hormones settle, I'll have her come tell you herself that everything is fine." He spoke with the casual, detached air of a man organizing tomorrow's clinic schedule. Just then, the OR doors swung open. Dr. Gibson pulled off his blood-stained mask, his voice raspy and dead, both of them, gone. And in the next room, Dan was still leaning over, gently blowing on the shallow scrape on Daphne's elbow. "Dr. Cooper, we need you to sign off on the OBGYN resuscitation records." Nurse Lisa stood at the door of the VIP suite holding a blue clipboard. Dan tested the temperature of a cup of water before handing it to Daphne. He didn't even turn around. "Leave it at the nurse's station. Can't you see Miss Bishop needs me right now?" "But Dr. Cooper, this record is highly unusual. It's about the patient from last night. What's so unusual about it? People require resuscitation in maternity every day." Dan cut her off. He pulled a tissue and wiped a stray drop of water from Daphne's lip. "I was up all night keeping Daphne stable. I don't have the bandwidth for paperwork. Have the clinical director sign it." Lisa opened her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She gripped the folder tight, but in the end, she said nothing. She turned and walked away. I followed her, watching as she slid my death certificate into a drawer, along with the tiny pink identification band that my baby never got to wear, both stuffed into a thick manila folder. The morgue was freezing. My baby and I lay inside a stainless steel drawer, unclaimed. With nowhere else to go, I drifted back to Dan. Daphne finished her water and timidly tugged at Dan's sleeve. "Dan, the way she looked at me last night, it was so full of hate, like she wanted to kill me." Do you think she's still angry? Is that why she's hiding from you? Dan pulled out his phone and stared at the empty iMessage thread, his brow furrowed. Normally, if he was gone for more than 2 hours, my texts would flood his screen, asking when he'd be home, asking if Daphne was having another crisis. But since last night, there had been nothing, just cold, gray silence. She's just stubborn, Dan said, his fingers typing quickly across the glass. She thinks I'm favoring you, so she's throwing a tantrum. I hovered over his shoulder, reading the words he sent to a dead woman. If you're done throwing a fit, text me back. Daphne has been through enough. Stop punishing her. A baby isn't a chess piece for you to win arguments with. Do you really think playing missing in action is going to make me back down? He locked the screen with a sharp snap. Daphne watched him, a tiny smug spark lighting up the depths of her eyes. She bit her lip, letting a tear fall. What if she calls the police? I'm so scared, Dan. Dan pulled out the copy of the signed waiver. With this, she can't press charges. Besides, she's a physician. She knows the consequences of making a scene. When she cools off, I'll have her apologize to you. She shouldn't have triggered you last night. I watched him calmly, listening to him use his gentlest, most reassuring voice to convict a corpse. Down the hall, 2 nurses whispered as they passed. Did you hear about the delivery last night? She bled out completely. I know. They couldn't save the baby either. A beautiful little girl, fully formed. Dan's hand froze midair, holding his water glass. He suddenly remembered, today was my due date. He stood up, a sudden, inexplicable weight pressing down on his chest. I'm going to check on maternity. He took a single step before Daphne clutched her arm and shrieked. It hurts! Dan, I'm so dizzy. Am I bleeding again? Is my wound opening? Dan spun around instantly, sitting back down on the edge of her bed to hold her hand. Outside, a nurse muttered to her colleague, the father listed on the deceased baby's chart. I think his last name was Cooper too. Before Dan could turn his head to listen, Daphne cried out again, throwing her arms around his neck, burying him in her panic. When Dan finally returned to our house, the nursery's nightlight was still casting its soft, warm glow. The light pooled over the brand new crib. I had washed and ironed the tiny sheets myself. The hospital bag sat open on the sofa, packed with neat rows of onesies and diapers. My prenatal chart lay on the entryway table. On the dining table, a handwritten note was held down by a glass, a meal plan I'd prepared for my postpartum recovery. Dan kicked off his shoes. Looking at the silent, empty living room, his scowl deepened. He probably expected me to be sitting on the couch, waiting to confront him with tear-swollen eyes, demanding to know why he chose Daphne first. But the house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. He walked over to the dining table and picked up the note. On the back, I had written a contingency plan for the birth. If I hemorrhage, please prioritize the baby. Save her first. If I don't make it off the table, tell Dan to keep Daphne far away from my daughter. Dan let out a cold laugh, crumpling the paper into a tight ball and tossing it into the trash can. Always the dramatist, he muttered. He pulled out his phone and dialed my number again. Only the cold, automated operator answered, telling him the phone was powered off. He opened our chat, typing furiously. You've made your point. It's time to come home. Your due date is literally any day now. Don't put your health at risk just to spite me. I've handled the situation with Daphne. She's sick, Hannah. You don't need to compete with a patient. Once the baby is here and you're on maternity leave, you'll have plenty of time. Maybe you can even help me monitor Daphne's therapy. The message is sent, but there was no bubble, no reply. Dan tossed the phone onto the sofa and rubbed his temples. Just then, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Pierce, my medical school mentor, the woman who had treated me like her own daughter. Dan answered, his tone returning to its usual polished, professional distance. Dr. Pierce, good evening. Dan, where are you right now? Dr. Pierce's voice was trembling, thick with a suppressed, toxic rage. Dan glanced at the crumpled note in the trash, assuming I had run to her to complain. I'm at home. If Hannah sent you to play mediator, tell her it's not going to work. If she wants an apology, she needs to walk through that door herself. She's about to be a mother. She needs to grow up. A heavy, ragged gasp came through the receiver. Grow up? Dan, do you have any goddamn idea what happened last night? Of course I do, Dan said, his voice dropping an octave, turning icy. Daphne had an episode and accidentally scratched her. I already made Daphne apologize. What else does she want? If she feels slighted, I'll buy her that diamond necklace she wanted once the baby is born. Consider it a peace offering. Are you completely soulless? Dr. Pierce screamed into the phone. You put that woman above your wife every single day, but last night was her due date. Before she could finish, Dan's work phone buzzed in his hand. A FaceTime call from Daphne. Without a second thought, Dan hung up on Dr. Pierce. He swiped to answer the video. On the screen, Daphne was hysterical, tears streaming down her face. Dan, you have to come back. I saw her. She was in my room. She had a knife, Dan. She said she was going to kill me. I'm so scared. Dan grabbed his car keys without hesitation. Don't panic. I'm on my way. As he reached the front door, his eyes caught a beautifully wrapped velvet box on the console table. He had bought it on a whim last week during a medical conference, a sterling silver baby bracelet. Engraved on the inside was the nickname we'd casually picked, Gracie.
Daphne's eyes were wild, unfocused. She was standing right there, she sobbed, pointing toward the darkened window. She was holding the baby. The baby's clothes were covered in blood. Dan followed her finger. The room was empty. Only his own reflection stared back at him from the glass. Daphne. His voice softened. There's nobody here. But I saw her. She grabbed his wrist so tightly her nails dug into his skin. She was staring at me. She wouldn't stop staring at me. Dan pulled her into his arms. You're exhausted. No. Daphne began shaking violently. She said she wanted her daughter back. Something cold slid down Dan's spine. For the first time since the incident, a feeling he couldn't quite name settled in his chest. Not guilt. Not yet. Unease. He looked away. His gaze landed on the nurses' station outside the room. Several nurses immediately lowered their heads. The moment they thought he wasn't looking, they resumed whispering. Dan frowned. As he stepped into the hallway, the conversation died instantly. What are you talking about? Nobody answered. Finally, Nurse Lisa spoke. Nothing, Dr. Cooper. Lisa. His voice sharpened. She swallowed. We were discussing Mrs. Cooper's case. The hallway fell silent. Dan's jaw tightened. Hannah is fine. Nobody said anything. Not a single person. The silence stretched longer and longer. Then one of the younger nurses whispered, Dr. Cooper. Her eyes filled with tears. Mrs. Cooper died 36 hours ago. The words hit him like a physical blow. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. That's not funny. Nobody laughed with him. Nobody even moved. She's upset with me. His voice became colder. She's avoiding my calls. Lisa's face crumpled. Dr. Cooper. She opened the drawer behind the station. Slowly. Carefully. Then she pulled out the thick manila folder. My file. My death certificate. The stillbirth report. The surgical records. The blood loss chart. The morgue transfer authorization. And on top, my wedding photograph. The one they used to identify the body. Dan stared at the stack. His expression didn't change. Not immediately. It was as if his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. No. His voice was barely audible. Lisa slid the death certificate toward him. No. He looked at the time. 8:07 p.m. Cause of death. Massive hemorrhage secondary to penetrating abdominal trauma. Beside it was another document. Female infant. Stillborn following maternal cardiac arrest. Dan's hands began to shake. No. The file slipped from his fingers. Pages scattered across the floor. One sheet landed face up. The blood bank report. 2 units reserved for Hannah Cooper. Released by authorization of Dr. Daniel Cooper. Time signed out. 6:58 p.m. His signature stared back at him. His own handwriting. His own name. His own decision. Suddenly he remembered. Dr. Gibson's exhausted face. The nurse asking for the resuscitation records. Dr. Pierce screaming over the phone. The nurses whispering about the deceased baby. The father listed as Cooper. Everything he had ignored. Everything he had chosen not to hear. The world tilted. Dan staggered backward. No. His voice cracked. That's impossible. But there it was. In black ink. In hospital records. In his own signature. His wife had bled to death. His daughter had died with her. And he had personally taken the blood that might have saved them. Behind him, Daphne appeared in the doorway. Dan? The moment she saw the paperwork spread across the floor, her face went white. Pure white. For a split second. Then she started crying. Dan, please. She rushed forward. I didn't mean. The words died when Dan looked at her. For years, Daphne had depended on one thing. Dan's compassion. His protectiveness. His inability to abandon her. But the man staring at her now looked like a stranger. His eyes were bloodshot. Empty. Terrifying. You knew. The words came out as a whisper. Daphne froze. Dan. You knew she was dying. No. You knew. His voice rose. You knew she was bleeding. Dan, listen to me. You stabbed my wife. Every nurse in the hallway stopped moving. You killed my daughter. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Daphne broke. It wasn't supposed to happen. The confession exploded from her. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The second the words left her mouth, she slapped both hands over her mouth. Too late. Every face in the hallway turned toward her. Dan went completely still. Daphne began sobbing. I just wanted to scare her. I just wanted her to leave. She took you away from me. Each word was another nail in the coffin. Dan's expression collapsed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It happened slowly. Like a building finally giving way after years of hidden structural damage. His knees buckled. He dropped onto the floor among the scattered pages. The death certificate. The blood bank report. The stillbirth record. He gathered them to his chest with trembling hands. And for the first time since I met him. For the first time since medical school. Dr. Daniel Cooper cried. Not the controlled tears of a grieving physician. Not the quiet sadness of a husband. He broke. Completely. Ugly, gasping sobs tore from his throat. His shoulders shook. His hands clawed at the papers, as if holding them tightly enough could somehow pull me and our daughter back. But I was standing only a few feet away, watching, unable to touch him, unable to comfort him, unable to hate him anymore, because hatred required someone to still matter. And somewhere between the operating room and the morgue drawer, the man I loved had already become a stranger. Meanwhile, security officers were hurrying down the hallway. Someone had called the police. And this time, there would be no waiver. No excuses. No second chances. The police arrived before midnight. Daphne was still sitting on the floor outside the VIP suite, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Her face was streaked with tears. Her hands trembled. But for once, nobody rushed to comfort her. Nobody told her it wasn't her fault. Nobody called her fragile. The officers quietly read her rights while a detective photographed the blood bank records, the surgical reports, and the signed waiver Dan had forced me to thumbprint. "Miss Bishop," the detective said calmly, "we need you to come with us." Daphne immediately turned to Dan. The way she always had. Like he would save her. Like he always had. "Dan." Her voice cracked. "Tell them I wasn't myself." Dan didn't answer. He sat motionless in a chair outside the nurse's station. My death certificate was still clenched in his hands. "Dan." Louder this time. The officers exchanged looks. One of them gently took Daphne's arm. She began to panic. "No." Her voice echoed down the hallway. "Dan, tell them." Still nothing. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a photograph clipped inside my chart. A prenatal ultrasound. Our daughter. The little girl neither of us would ever meet. The officers led Daphne away. Her screams grew fainter, then disappeared completely. The hallway became silent again. Only then did Dan move. He looked up at Lisa. "Where is she?" Lisa swallowed. "Doctor, where is Hannah?" The question shattered something inside everyone who heard it. Because there was no version of that question that ended well. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. The morgue. Dan stopped breathing. For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then he stood. Slowly. Like an old man carrying a weight too heavy for his body. The walk to the basement took less than 3 minutes. For Dan, it felt like an eternity. Every hallway held memories. There was the cafeteria where we studied together during residency. The courtyard where he proposed. The elevator where I had shown him our first ultrasound photo. Every step was haunted. When the morgue attendant opened the drawer, Dan almost collapsed. There I was. Still. Pale. Cold. The bruises beneath my eyes darker now. The surgical incision visible beneath the sheet. And bundled against my side. Our daughter. Tiny. Perfect. Beautiful. The bracelet engraved with Gracie was still in Dan's pocket. His fingers found it automatically. The silver trembled in his hand. "No." The word came out broken. He dropped to his knees. "No." His forehead pressed against the steel drawer. His shoulders shook violently. This wasn't the crying from earlier. This was devastation. The kind that tears something out of a person forever. "I was coming." His voice cracked. "I was going to come see you." Silence answered. "I didn't know." Another lie. Even he knew it. The warnings had been there. The nurses. Dr. Gibson. Dr. Pierce. The blood request. The due date. My messages stopping completely. He had known enough to ask questions. He had simply chosen not to. Because every time reality threatened the story he wanted to believe, he chose Daphne. Again. And again. And again. Until there was nothing left to choose. Hours later, Dr. Pierce arrived. She found him exactly where she'd expected. Still kneeling beside the drawer. Still holding the tiny silver bracelet. "You came." Dan's voice was hollow. Dr. Pierce looked at me. Then at my daughter. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "I promised Hannah I'd be there." Dan flinched. "You spoke to her?" "A week before she died." The silence stretched. Then Pierce reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope. I was supposed to give this to you after the delivery. Dan stared at the handwriting on the front. His hands began shaking instantly. Because it was mine. To my husband. If you're reading this, something went wrong. Dan's breath hitched. Dr. Pierce handed him the letter. Then quietly walked away. Giving him privacy. Giving him consequences. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a single page. A letter written 2 weeks before my due date. Dan, if you're reading this, our daughter is probably already here. Maybe you're holding her while laughing at how much hair she has. Maybe I'm sleeping after 20 hours of labor. Or maybe neither of those things happened. Doctors understand risk better than most people. I know what could happen. That's why I wanted to leave this behind. First, if Gracie is safe, tell her I loved her before I ever saw her face. Tell her she was wanted every second of her life. Tell her her mother would have chosen her every time. Without hesitation. The paper blurred. Tears were falling onto the page now. Dan kept reading. And you. I know you're trying your best. Even when it doesn't feel like it. I know your heart is kind. That's why I fell in love. With you. You never stopped trying to save people. Just don't forget that your family needs saving too. Especially when it's easier to save someone else. Dan's hands began trembling uncontrollably. The next line nearly stopped his heart. If there's one thing I'm afraid of, it's not dying. It's becoming second place to Daphne forever. The letter slipped from his fingers. The morgue became impossibly quiet. Because even 2 weeks before her death, I had known. I had seen it. I had understood exactly where I stood. And somehow, despite everything, I had still loved him. Dan buried his face in his hands. For the first time, there were no excuses left. No misunderstandings. Only the truth. He had not killed me with the knife. But he had handed away the blood. He had ignored every warning. And when the choice came, he had chosen wrong. By dawn, the entire hospital knew. And by sunset, so would everyone else.